Yesterday, we discussed the Shitas HaRambam on Lo Savaro Eish B'Chol Moshel Seichel. And if you recall, both the Aruch LaNer, that's going back 150 years ago, more than that, even closer to 200 years ago, and the Rabbi Yerucham Perla, in his commentary on the Rasag Sefer HaMitzvos, that's going back 100, maybe 120 years ago. Both of them came to the conclusion that according to the Rambam, there's a prohibition on Shabbos of implementing onshu. And that's derived from Lo Savaro Eish B'Chol Moshel Seichel B'Yom Shabbos. So on the one hand, the Rambam paskins Havara Lechalek Yotzes, meaning Havara, like Rabbi Nosson Shita, is an Av Malacha. On the other hand, if it's an Av Malacha, what is the Torah telling me? Okay, that's one din of Chiluk Chatos, that each Malacha unto itself generates its own Chatos. But what is B'Chol Moshel Seichel that seems to address Bezdin, and that prohibits Bezdin from implementing any sort of punishment. And when I say any sort of punishment, I emphasize that because it means even an onich which would not entail violating the Shabbos. There is no malacha, presumably, in Malchus, and yet the Rambam would include Malchus in this Isser of Lo Savaro Eish. So we have the body of 39 malachas, and Mechalel Mos Yumas, that's a capital crime if you violate any of those malachas. Then we have a list that we spoke about yesterday of various Isurei Lavin, one of which, according to the Rambam, is Onshin. Now, the last thing that we discussed yesterday was the Aruch LaNer, which you'll see here on the bottom of your page Nun, going on to the top of page Nun Aleph. Just to review the Aruch LaNer, he says the following. This raises an issue. How do we know that Misa Atzma Eina Doche Es HaShabbos? In other words, maybe what the Torah is saying is that in the mitzvah of taking a condemned criminal and putting that criminal to death, it could be that we're talking about violating the Shabbos with a hechsher mitzvah. And therefore, since we're not ready yet to take the life of the condemned, first we have to prepare the psil, and we have to do a bishul, and perhaps havara. Those are all preliminary stages. V'shemelo Amar Torah el shehechsher mitzvah, in the cases of havara and bishul, eino doches haShabbos. But how do we know misa atma minayin she'eino doches haShabbos? Maybe what the Torah is saying is that all the preliminary stages or steps necessary to heat up make the lead into molten lead that you can pour, etc., etc. I'm going to go into the gory details. Those do not override the Shabbos. Take care of that before Shabbos. Make sure it's set in place. But the actual implementation of the death penalty, which is the mitzvah itself, as we saw the pasuk says behumas, maybe that would override the Shabbos. Says the Aruch LaNer, we have to prove now, we have no choice, the Rambam Shita, namely, that the prohibition here is not the malacha, but rather the onech. And therefore, if the Iser is the onech rather than the malacha, we have a hekesh that says mishpat echad yilach, equating all onshim, all misas bezdin. We're going to derive, based on that hekesh, that onech does not override the Shabbos, whether it means the hechsher mitzvah in the case of havar and bishul, or whether it means the misa itself, it does not override the Shabbos. And we're going to derive this from the fact that the Torah is prohibiting here, according to the Rambam, the onech itself. But now we have to ask the following question, which is raised by Rabbi Yerucham Perla, L'shitasa, based on his understanding of the Rambam. how we derive from this pasuk lo saviru eish b'chol shosech yom Shabbos for kol haTorah essay is tocha losa, even though the losa is in losa sheish bo kares, which Gemara is using this price of Rabbi Shmuel to justify the need for a special limud of Oleha in the case of Yibum Bi'achos Ishto, because Esei Dochalosa Sheish Bokares. How can you prove such a thing? We need the pasuk legufe. Legufe means that if the pasuk was superfluous, then you would say that the Torah is telling me that this is an exception to the rule rather than the rule. But here I need the pasuk legufe, because the pasuk is teaching me that onshim are prohibited on Shabbos, even if there is no malach. For example, in the case of Malchus, as we discussed. So how could the Gemara derive conclusions, which was the entire impetus of this whole sugya, about Esei Dochalosa Sheish Bo Karetz, when you need the pasuk legufe? The Torah is teaching me that onshim are prohibited on Shabbos. And even in the case of Malchus, where there is no violation of the Shabbos. He says, "V'afshe miloshen habraysa achein mashma shelulei lo savaru hayisi matir es etzem hamisa b'shabbos harei min hakosim ein raya." In other words, the braysa, the way the Gemara quotes Rabbi Shmuel's braysa, it seems to indicate that our Havamina was that even the Misa itself would override the Shabbos. Means that we're talking about Esei Dochalosasa, because the Misa is the essay itself. And it's inherent in the power of the essay to override the Shabbos. But the Reed Perlow is not happy with that answer, because the pasuk itself doesn't prove anything. Maybe the Lashon HaBraisa would prove something, but the Tana himself, how did he know such a thing? There was a Havamina that essay would be Dochalosa Sheish Bo Kares. Maybe the Torah is simply Legufe establishing an Isser of Onshim B'Shabbos, irrelevant to whether he violates a malach. Like, for example, Chutz L'Tchum or Machamed. Any of these cases, he doesn't violate the Shabbos, but the Torah prohibited on Shabbos. The Torah is now prohibiting Onshim on Shabbos, despite the fact that there's no desecration of the Shabbos. How can you prove anything about Esei Dochalosas? And in effect, this is a kasha, according to the Rambam, even on the Brisa itself for Rabbi Shmuel, because Rabbi Shmuel wants to derive the conclusion, as the Gemara quotes the Brisa, that this case is the exception. The rule is that Esei Dochalosa Sheish Bo Karetz. Okay. So that kasha right now remains an outstanding kasha. The next paragraph, which is an extension of our discussion, is an apparent contradiction, which is always a lot of fun, between two of the Rambam's works. The Rambam in the Mishnah Torah as opposed to the Sefer HaMitzvos. In the Mishnah Torah, we assume that the Isser Onshim derived from Lo Savaru Eish B'Chol Moshel Seichem applies even in the case of Malchus. But when we open up the Sefer HaMitzvos, in Los HaSashim Chav Beis, we get a different impression. The Rama writes his Harinu, the Torah warns us or prohibits Be'onech from implementing Onshim, Hagidorim, Alachotim. I think he means by Gidorim, again, this is a translation from the Arabic, that the purpose of an onesh is to create sort of a fence around the Torah, to protect the Torah. And this kind of implementation of onshim, of chotim, is prohibited on Shabbos. Ulahavir sadina b'yom Shabbos, meaning push aside and delay all the implementation of onshim of dinim on Shabbos. Shabbos is in a sense antithetical to dinim. I'm sure there are philosophical ideas here too. Shabbos is a day of joy, of chesed, of Shama Yisrael. It's not a day of the opposite, of dinim, of punishing. And the Rama derises, who much amru lo savaru eish b'chomosh l'seichim yom Shabbos yirtzu b'zeh. The Rambam says, what do we derive from this pasuk? This is all the lashon of the Rambam. Shelo tisrof michin ischai b'sreifa. V'hu adin l'shar. What's the next word? Misos. No mention of Malchus. So the Rambam opens up with onshim. Then he goes on to the pasuk. The pasuk itself addresses only sreifa. Now he extrapolates from sreifa, expanding it to all shar misos, the other three misos bezdin. And he quotes the Mechilta, lo savaru eish. Sreifa b'chlal ha'isa v'yatzis l'lamed. Sreifa was included in Kol Malacha Lo Sasu. It's one of the 39 malachas. Why was it taken out? Masreif miyuchedes she achas mibisus bezdin. Fi eina dochas haShabbos av kol shar misus bezdin lo yitchus haShabbos. And again, in the Rambam's quote of the Mechilta, you see clearly that we're dealing with the malachas. I'm sorry, with the misos, but not with onshim in general, meaning with malchus. Ubi Gemara to Bnei Maravi quotes Yushalmi b'chol moshe seichmon Rabbi Ila b'shem Rabbi Yanai mikan lebati dinim lo yu donim b'Shabbos. Now that last phrase, I think, is critical, but the Achronim don't seem to make a big deal about that. But I'm going to try to make a big deal about it because he quotes the Magen Avram. Semashmos divrei Aram sefer mitzvah sha'isur dafka ksheyesh ba'onech kil Shabbos. Meaning that we're referring to Mises Bezdin, which is one of the 39 malachas that's called Netilas Neshama. The Lokafisha Mashma, this is contradictory to the Rambam in Mishneh Torah, Sha'af Malchus, She'ein Be'em Chilul Shabbos, Asuros B'Shabbos. So what is it? Is the Torah prohibiting Misa? And from Sreifa, I'm going to extrapolate all four Mises Bezdin. Those are prohibited on Shabbos because they entail violation of Meleches Netilas Neshama, or can we go beyond that, the way we've understood it in the Repearl Out and the Aruch LaNer, that the Rambam Pshita is, and that's the implication of the Rambam Mishneh Torah, that this is an all-encompassing Isur of Onshim, even if the implementation of Onesh does not entail violation of the Shabbat. For example, the case of what? Rabbi, say, help me out here. Malchus, right? Malchus is not a violation of Shabbos. And the Magen Avram doesn't understand the Magen Mishnah. He equates the Rambam in the Mishneh Torah with the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvot. Ulam lefi divrei Aruch LaNer v'agri pirlo anal mimashahevi Ramas divrei Mechilta mashmash kamanaso lesar es haonesh bi'atzmo Shabbos v'lo mishum chilul Shabbos. Honestly, I don't see what he means by that, because if you look at the Rambam's quote of the Mechilta makes an equation between Sreifa and the other Mises Bezdin. Where do you see in the Mechilta any indication that Malchus, for example, would be included? The language of the Mechilta is Af Kol Shar Mises Bezdin, and it's based on the Hekesh of Sreifa to the other Mises Bezdin. So this last piece, I don't understand what he means. Honestly, I'd write a letter to the editor. But what I do want to point out, in defense of the Magen Mishnah, who would reconcile the two Rambams, that at the end of the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvos, he quotes a Yerushalmi. And why did he quote the Yerushalmi? Yerushalmi says, "B'chol moshchol seichem," right? Don't burn a fire b'chol moshchol seichem. And what is b'chol moshchol seichem? Batei dinim. Shelo yu danim b'Shabbos. Look at that word danim. Danim means onshim. It doesn't mean misa per se. It's not limited to the dalit misas bez. That's what I would say. And therefore, the Magen Mishnah assumes that even in the Sefer HaMitzvos, the Rambam waves the flag that all onshim, even those that do not entail chil Shabbos, are prohibited by virtue of the pasuk of Savaro Eish B'chol. And now the Gemara establishes that the language of the Gemara here on Daf Vav base, time of the Kos Rachmana Lo Sevaru, if not for the pasuk Lo Sevaru, Halav Hachi Dachi, the mitzvah of the humas of implementing Mises Bezdin would override the Shabbos, even though Shabbos is a lav sheyesh bo kares. Later on, if you recall, based on Rav Shimi, we reinterpret the Brisa, and it's based on Kal V'chomer, and it's not based on Esei Dochalosis. Now we have a problem. And this is the issue of what's called Mekalkel B'Havor. As we said yesterday, lighting a fire is a little bit different than all the other malachas. All the other malachas are constructive, whereas lighting a fire is destructive. And now we have machlokas tanoim between Rav Shimon and Rav Yehuda and Hilchos Shabbos. Normally, if we have machlokas between Rav Shimon and Rav Yehuda and Hilchos Shabbos, it's always that Rav Shimon is the mekil and Rav Yehuda is the machmir. Here's the exception. After Rav Shimon is the machmir. Rav Shimon says that destructive lighting of a fire is chayav on Shabbos, which means that the universal principle of malachos, that makalkel, a destructive act, is potter on Shabbos, has one exception, and that exception is going to be havara. When the Torah says lo savaro eish b'chomosh l'seichem, it's indicating that even a destructive fire constitutes a malach on Shabbos. That's the sheet of Rav Shimon. And he derives it from our pasuk, and specifically from the fact that the Torah prohibits havaras bas kohen, havara meaning burning a fire, in order to implement the death penalty of sreifa in the case of bas kohen shesinsa on Shabbos. And even though we're dealing with a case of makalkel, now watch what's happened here. This is really a very subtle point, or there's a real nuance here, because I'm not sure if this streifa is makalkel. What you're doing is you're implementing Misas Bezdin. Is that a makalkel? Well, somebody's losing their life. That's a pretty serious kill. But on the other hand, this is done within the framework of Misas Bezdin for the sake of meting out punishment to a criminal. This is not just I burned down someone's haystack, which is makalkel. But in any event, we could call it mostly makalkel. It's, if you had to classify it, it's 90% kill. She loses her life. And from this, the fact that the Torah prohibits taking the life of this condemned Bas Kohen on Shabbos, we prove that even a makalkel is chayav in the case of havara. That havara is chayav even though it's a makalkel. Says Tosfos, our sugya is against Reb Shimon, because our sugya is deriving the principle of esei docha losas. And in the case of a losa sheyesh bo kares, meaning that why did the Torah have to bother telling me that this is prohibited? It's totally superfluous. I know that it's prohibited, unless I don't know it's prohibited, meaning that I would apply the principle of esei docha losa even in kares. Tosfos, I don't get it. According to Reb Shimon, there's an amazing chiddush here that the Torah has to be machadish, and there's no choice in the matter. The Torah had to write lo zavaro eish b'chomosh l'seichem in the case of Misas Bezdin, which is a makalkel case, to teach me that the malacha of mavir applies even in kilkul. And although kol makalkel p'turim, the exception is mavir. By the way, we have a similar machlokas. I don't want to get off on a tangent. In the case of chabura, if you wound a person, there also you're destructive, and yet you're chayav mishum b'tilas neshama. In any event, we're back to the same word legufe that we had earlier. That according to the Rambam, the question was, and that was the kasha of the Riperla, we need this pasuk legufe to teach me that there are no onshim on Shabbos. Has nothing to do with esei docha losa. So now we're asking the same question in a different format. According to Reb Shimon, I need the pasuk legufe to teach me to establish that you chayav avara even in the case of a kalkul. Therefore, Tosfos says that our sugya can only reflect the shita of Yehuda, who holds that kol makalkul pturim even with regard to avara. If kol makalkul pturim even with regard to avara, we just said that burning a kohen, a bas kohen, is a kilkul. So this is what's called modus tollens in fancy Latin, if you study even a basic course in logic. What we're saying is that havara is a makalkul. And we have a general principle that kol makalkul pturim. Why then do I need the possible Savaro H in the case of Havaras Bas Kohen? Anyway, Makalkul of unless the pasuk is telling me that in general, essay would be Dochalosas. But we're not up to that yet because we're operating within the framework of Leguf, meaning that we need the pasuk to teach me that this is awesome. Why? Because otherwise I would have said it's mutter, not because of essay Dochalosas, but because kol makalkul pturim. This is just an application to a specific case of the general principle kol makalkul pturim. But let's ask the flip side. Why does the Torah prohibit implementing the death penalty in the case of a bas kohen shezinsa on Shabbos if kol makalkul pturim? Why is it prohibited? So Bishlei, according to Reb Shimon, is wonderful because Reb Shimon holds that the exception to kol makalkul pturim is v'lechas havara, and this we're going to derive from the Isur of Sreifas Bas Kohen on Shabbos, that anybody who lights a fire, even if he burns down the house, is chayav. It's a makalkul gov, but you're chayav. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says kol makalkul pturim applies even to avara. So if you burn down someone's haystack, you're not chayav. So why did the Torah prohibit implementing the death penalty in the case of Sreifas Bas Kohen Shezin? So Yehuda has no choice. He's forced to assume that this is not a makalkul. And I would say that Rabbi Yehuda looks at the overall picture. Of course, taking someone's life is a kill. But if you're doing it for a greater purpose, I'll give you an example. The Gemara has a pasuk in Perek Rav Elazar the Mila that Mila is doche Shabbos. What do we need a pasuk for? He's drawing blood from the baby. That's a makalkul. There's one Madyon who says that makalkul b'chabura is chai, but let's go according to Madyon. Kol makalkul pturim even chovel b'chavera. So then bris milah is a classic case of makalkul. Why do I need a pasuk to be mated milah on Shabbos? It's not a malach at all. And the answer is that there is an element of tikkun in a broader sense. We're not just destroying and drawing blood from the baby. It's for a greater purpose. It's within a framework of a mitzvah. Here too, this is what the Torah commanded me to do. You can't tell me that what the Torah commands me to do, in this case, to take the life of the criminal, is makalkul. So Yehuda, as opposed to Reb Shimon is focused on the mice itself. Just look at the action. Zoom in on the action. If you focus on the action itself and you blot out all the background noise, then you're talking about a makalkul, you're taking her life. And therefore, Reb Shimon derives from this Isur of Lo Savaro Eish, that phenomenal revolutionary conclusion that makalkul doesn't apply in the case of Avar Yechaifa. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, says, no. This is not called makalkul. This is fulfilling the will of God and the mitzvah of vehumas. It cannot be considered a makal. It's not some sort of purposeless act of destroying. So now our sugya should work out well according to Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Because Rabbi Yehuda holds that although Havar is potter in the case of a kalkel, Havaras Maskoin is a tikkun and not a kilkul. And therefore you have a violation of Meleches Shabbos when you burn whatever you burn for the sake of the mitzvah of Maskoin. And what was the Havamina? That you could violate Meleches Havara? It must have been the essay of a humas that's docha the losis of Shabbos. Hence, I derive from this time because of Rachmana lo sevaru halav hachi dachi. That in general the rule would be, if not for this particular case, that essay docha losis sheish kares is therefore behechrech bar kosel olamed gam al tchias essay lelosas sheish kares. Wait a minute, we're not really out in the clear yet, because there was a serious havamina. There is a violation of the Havara. So there is a serious havamina that Esri. In other words, if not for the Apostle Savara, we would have applied the principle of Esri Dochalosis, that even though it's a Losa Shishol Kares. Again, you could always ask the question, maybe the Torah is coming to tell me that ain't Esri Dochalosis. Why are we assuming that this is the exception to the right? That was the Tosfos here that the Imtomar, right? This was the last of the skinny lines on Vavam Beis. Tostim Rascal Taima, he says, Kevil Gufa Yitzrich is Adar of Neif Miochi Delo Dachi. The law Amrinon. Right? Mali Chumer Rab and Mali Chumer Zutra. Or rather, the low Dachi, and we differentiate between a Chumer Rab and a Chumer Zutra. And an essay cannot override Shabbos or any Losas, including Achos Ishta. Okay, so that kasha we have an answer to. That's a chov, a debt that we have to pay up and try to come up with Tosas, the answer to Tosas kasha. But I don't want to get off that yet. Make a page here so I don't forget where to find it. But Shem Lokein, Hayolanu Litor Lashvenu Din Makalka Vavara, Shalo B'Mako Mitzvah. Umikach Sheshmia HaTorah Din Zeh B'Mako Mitzvah Mucha She'af Bol Lamdenu Shesei Dochalosis. There are nuances here that we don't understand. He's saying that the Torah could have found a different parsha. I don't know exactly which parsha he has in mind to teach me this din of Havara, that Havara is considered a tikkun and not a kilkul, according to Yehuda, if there's a greater good, a greater purpose. Why did the Torah choose to teach me this? Dafka in the case of a mitzvah. I would have asked a naive question on Tosfos. I would have said, wait a minute, maybe the Torah is choosing a mitzvah because what makalkel could be upgraded to the status of a mitzvah? What makes it into scratch it. What element could make makalkel into a tikkun? How do you take a makalkel, which is inherently destructive, and redefine its complexion and call it a tikkun? Unless it's a mitzvah element. So I don't know what Tosfos means. He should have told me this. Shalom b'makom mitzvah, shalom b'makom mitzvah. I don't know what would have removed the status of a kalka, make it into a taka. So again, there are details here that have to be ironed out. But the basic point to Tosfos is that there are two chidushim written in the same pasuk. One chidush is a chidush in Hilchos Ma'avir, in Meleches Havara, that Meleches Havara is prohibited on Shabbos, even in a case that you would have defined and classified as Mekalkel because of the mitzvah which makes it into a tikkun. And number two, once having taught that this Mavir, because it's a mitzvah of Behemis, right, Behumas, therefore would have the power to override Shabbos. That teaches me Allah of Esei, even in the case of Lotas Hashish. And now Rabbi Kivega wants to prove that our sugya could be reconciled even with Rabbi Shimon against Tosfos. Hello, Gamla Rabbi Shimon, if you're following the place on the top of Nun Aleph, on the left column. The Bechol Moshvosechem, meaning the prohibition addressing Bezdin, Shebechol Torah, Esei Docholos Sheish Bokar, Sharei Bavoros Baskoin, Benka, Yesh Mishum Meleches Shabbos, the Af Im Mekalke Bavor Potu, Harehi Asur Mishum Netilos Neshama, Nimta, Shalule, Shebechol Torah, Esei Docholos Sheish Bokares, Lo Yitachen, Lomar, Sheba Moshvosechem, Lesar Avoros Baskoin, Ulamid Shebekalke Bavor Chayo, Sharei Af Belav Hachi, Iasura. Now, it seems to me that Rabbi Kivega is not differentiating between Kares and Misas Bezdin. And he's saying that even if I drop the ball on Mavir, forget about Mavir for a moment. Let's leave out the Havara element, which is an involvement in burning down lead and converting it to a molten lead. Forget about all that. Let's just talk about the fact that whole life is being terminated. That itself is a malach, not a malach of Havara or Bishul, but rather malach of the Netilas Neshama. It's also on the list of 39. Actually, it doesn't say Netilas Neshama. I think it says Shochet, but that's what it is. It's Netilas Neshama. Mimela, if there was a Havamina that you would implement the death penalty on Shabbos in the case of the condemned criminal, that would prove that Esei Tochalosis. You're telling me that according to Reb Shimon, I need the possible Gufe to establish that Havara, even in the case of Mekalkel, is a Malacha Shabbos, a violation of Shabbos. Forget about Meleches Mavir. Let's just focus for a moment on the Havamina that we would take the neshama of this woman, which would entail a violation of Meleches Netilas Neshama. What was the Havamina in such a case? You have no right to derive conclusions now that according to Reb Shimon, we don't know anything about Esei Dochalo. So you have to introduce Esei. Says Reb Kivega, logically you are compelled, without a choice, to introduce Esei Dochalosa, even according to Reb Shimon. You can waver back and forth on as to whether Havara is a violation of Shabbos in this case, because Havara, for the purpose of destroying a life, might be considered a Mekalkel. Okay, fine. You can vacillate back and forth on that. But if there's a Havamina that this procedure, Misas Bezin, would override the Shabbos, then leaving out Mavir, just focus for a moment exclusively on the Netilas Neshama, you must be operating within the framework of Esei Dochalo. And therefore, Kivega argues against Tosfos that even according to Reb Shimon, we could reconcile our Gemara that the Havamina was that Esei Dochalosa sheyesh bo kar. Now here I see a note. I'm not sure exactly. You can look at the note. It's number Vav if you like. I'm just going to present my intuition as to what the answer to Rabbi Akiva Eiger's point is, the counter on it. Maybe it's what he means in the note. I don't want to plagiarize. Tosfos holds that if there's a chiddush in Hilchas Mavir that is derived from this pasuk, you have no right to derive other conclusions with regard to the ability or the possibility of overriding Shabbos under a different malach, namely under the malach of Netilas Neshama. Meaning, once I justify this pasuk according to Rav Shimon, because it's revolutionizing Meleches Havara in a way that it's totally unique on the radar screen, the constellation of all malachas. It breaks all the rules. It's not a case of a kalkul and petura. Then I need this pasuk. Once I need this pasuk, then the logic of what's the language, the Gemara, of holav hachidachi, meaning that this is a pasuk which teaches me that esei dochalosa said. How do you know that? Once I need the pasuk to teach me that mavir is chayv and mekalkel, what gives you the right to say, well, I'll also derive another conclusion from this pasuk? So Rabbi Akiva Eiger l'shita, so he's saying I can derive two chidushim from the same pasuk because number one, there was a havamina that havara would be a malacha. Obviously, we're suspending the principle of mekalkel. Number two, there was a havamina that destroying the life of this criminal is overrides the Shabbos because destroying the life is a violation of Meleches Shabbos. And apparently, if not for Lo Savaro Eish, we would be allowed to take her life for the sake of the mitzvah of Behumas. Says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, that itself will teach me that esei dochalosas. Whereas Tosfos might be going with a more technical rule, namely that once I need the pasuk and it's justified to teach me X, I have no right to derive Y. Once I need the pasuk to teach me that Meleches Havara is chayav even b'mekalkel, and that's Rav Shimon Shita, I can't go a step beyond that and say, well, the pasuk is justified to teach me some other chiddush, namely that esei dochalosas, say even in the case of Koros. I can't do that. The pasuk is already accounted for. I need it to teach me halach and mavir, and that's Rav Shimon. Rabbi Akiva Eiger, again, is not bothered by that. In Rabbi Akiva Eiger's frame of reference, you could derive as many conclusions as you want from one pasuk. Because this pasuk is telling me two things. Number one, that there's a violation of Meleches Havara, and that's halacha according to Rav Shimon, that even though it's mekalkel yichai. And number two, the Torah is also telling me, in addition to classifying Havara as a malacha, it's also telling me that we would override Melechot Shabbos for the sake of the mitzvah of Humas, because otherwise, obviously it's us. Says Tosfos, no, what do you mean obviously it's us? No, the Torah is telling me Lo Savaro H to establish something about Meleches Havara. It's not teaching me something about esei dochalosas. But Rabbi Akiva Eiger is saying the following. Yeah, the pasuk is telling me that you're chayiv for mavir, even though it's makal. But it's also telling me that we don't violate meleches havar on Shabbos, even though there's a mitzvah. Something on meleches havar. Tosfos' argument. I don't need the pasuk to tell me that because of this isur, I don't override the Shabbos. The Torah is just telling me that it's awesome. And therefore, we can assume that ain't essay dochalosas in the case of Kodesh. If ain't essay dochalosa, then what was the need for this pasuk? The pasuk wants to tell me something about an internal point about the nature of the meleches havar, according to Rashi. Because this is the source of Rav Shimon that havar is chayiv even b'makal. So at the end of the day, who's writing? Let me try one more time to understand Rabbi Vega's mentality. We can derive two conclusions. Number one, something about meleches havar. Number two, we don't override the Shabbos for the sake of the meleches havar. Yes, says Tosfos. I'll tell you why we don't override the Shabbos for the sake of meleches havar. For the sake of Mrs. Sreifus Pascal. You know why? Because ain't essay dochalosas. So then you're going to ask me, Rabbi Tzvek, so why do I need the pasuk if ain't essay dochalosas? The answer is the pasuk is telling me something about meleches havar. And that's something that Rabbi Kivega can't tolerate. Rabbi Kivega is saying, what do you mean? The Torah is telling you something about meleches havar, but the Torah is telling you not to implement that malach on Shabbos. Meaning that the mitzvah itself doesn't override Shabbos. So it is telling me something. And that is that a lav sheish bo kares is not subject to a techiyah. And that in this case, a lav sheish bo kares is not subject to techiyah, but universally elsewhere, essay dochalosa sheish bo kares. And maybe that comes back to what we saw here, that he says, "Im lokein hoyel wanu la Torah on the bottom of the right column, lashmienu din mekalkel ba'avara shelo b'mokum mitzvah." Now that becomes a critical point. Let me just again. He doesn't give you the nuances here, the details. But what he's saying is that there's out there in the world, there are other cases of makalkel ba'avar that the Torah could have spoken about and prohibited. Wait a minute, that supports what the or the post. Wait a minute, that's going to support. Why did it? So what I just read to you is not Tosfos, it's the re of Tosfos, meaning until now we presented Tosfos that our suya could not be reconciled with Rav Shimon. But that line that I read to you, that's the re in Tosfos. He wants to disagree with Tosfos based on that. So if that be the case, Rabbi Kivega is really just saying shot in the real. Let's just read it again. Rabbi Kivega v'Divrei Halo gam Rabbi Shimon Muchach Kol Moshe Sechem Shebechol Torah Esei Dochalos Shish B'Koris Reba, Oras, Pasko, and Bekach. Also, Kvega is introducing Netilas Neshama. The Re was focused totally on Strafe, on Mavi. Shalule, Tochi Lom, Shekvomosh, Lesser, Avoras, Bas, Coin, Sheyapalaf. So the Vegas saying was, Posk is telling me that Seifas Bas coin does not override the shop. Again, but Tosus is saying the Posk is telling me a Chiddush in Mavi. So what's Rabbi Vegas point? There's Natilas Neshama. Rabbi Vegas is convinced that B'chol Mosh Hosechem is coming to prohibit Avoras Bas Kohen on Shabbos. Now, Havaras Bas Kohen entails two different malachos, Mavir and Netilas Neshama. So Rabbi Vegas says, forget about the Mavir element in this equation. Just focus on the Netilas Neshama element. And this pasuk with Chomosh Hosechem is telling you that by burning this woman, you'll end up with a violation of malacha, and therefore it's awesome. Which means that even though in Kol Tarkulesi Dokolosa Shishmo Kares, but here is the exception to the rule. So Rabbi Kivega is absolutely convinced that the Torah is coming to tell you that that which you think is mutter is us. And it cannot be focusing exclusively on Havara, because there's also the Netilas Neshama. The Torah must be telling me that Netilas Neshama is prohibited. Yeah, but that's only if you hold Mekalka B'Chabura Ba'avara is Chai. Reb Shimon holds Mekalka Ba'avara. Reb Shimon holds Mekalka B'Chabura is Chai. How do you justify B'chol Moshe Seichem? You're going to tell me, well, I'm going to justify B'chol Moshe Seichem because it teaches me that Avara, even in the case of Mekalka, is Chai. No, you have no right to derive that. So I don't understand. Rabbi Kivega is really asking a kasha on the Gemara itself. It's not just asking a kasha on the Tosfos. Gemara says that Rabbi Shimon derives the conclusion that Mavir is Chai b'Mekalkil from this pasuk. What right does Rabbi Shimon have to derive that? Maybe the pasuk is saying that Netilas Neshama is a malach that you violate when you put this woman to death, and we're not going to apply Esei Dochalosas. According to Rabbi Kivega, I don't get it. The pasuk says which entails Netilas Neshama. Torah is saying that this is prohibited. The Torah is Netilas Neshama. It could be that the Malach of Mavir, he did not file against Reb Shimon because it was a Makalka. So I don't get it. I think Beg is asking a kash on the Gemara itself. What's the footnote here? Nun Vav. Oh, that was the one in brackets. So that's my comment. Okay. So let's just make a note here because I want to do some Gemara here. Okay. So now Rabbi said, let's go back to the Gemara on Daf Zayin. And we're up to Mid Domid, which is a little bit below Tosas Dibra Masel Talmud Loma. You see that like 2 or 3 lines below that. The line starts again, it's not going to help you much, but with the word Sharia. So I don't know if he breaks up Mid Domid into a new paragraph. No, I don't think so. Because actually, we have to backtrack a little to appreciate this Mid Domid. The Gemara had quoted a brisa, which formulates a principle called Dover Shaya B'Chlal, V'Yotza Min HaKlal, Lo L'Lamed Al Atzmo Yotza, El L'Lamed Al HaKlal Kulo Yotza. So we have a klal that all arayos are prohibited. We have an exception to the rule in a case of Eishes Ach, and that's called Yibum. And now we're going to say that this case of Eishes Ach is not just a single exception, but rather it's Malamed on the Klal Kulo. And if not for the Pasuk Leah, we would assume that any Iser Ereva, even above and beyond Eishes Ach, would be permitted for the sake of the mitzvah Yibum. But the Brisa builds its argument based on the Brisa of Rabbi Shmuel. The Brisa of Rabbi Shmuel is the Brisa of Yud Gimel Midol Shator Nidreshes. So what we want to do today, I mean, with the short time that we have, is to compare the paradigmic case of this Midah, Shator Nidreshes, with the application of that paradigmic case to Yibum. So what is the paradigmic case of Dover Shei B'Chlal, V'Yotza B'Chlal, Lo Lamed Al Atzmo Yotza, Lo Klal Ku Yotza? That's going to be the case of eating Kodshim B'Tumah. The Torah says, HaNefesh Sheyochel Basar, Tumas or Olav. So that's a general principle that you ate from Sarah Zevach and you were Tomei. But then the Torah says, Mizevach HaShlomim. And the Torah earmarks or specifies Shlomim. Now, Shlomim is included in all Kodshim. That's based on a pasuk that says, Kol Isha Asher Yakriv Mikol Zarachem El HaKadoshim Asher Yakdishu B'nei Yisrael Hashem V'Tumasa Olav V'Nichrasa Nefesh Hahi L'Fana. So once the Torah had already told me that with regard to Kodshim in general, if you're Tumasa Olav, you're in a state of Tum and you ate the Kodshim, you're Chayav Kares, why did the Torah now need a special pasuk to single out Shlomim? And the answer is Lahakish Aleim V'Lo Melcha Mashlomim Yuchadim Shem Kodshim Mizbech Af Kol Shu Kodshim Mizbech. And this comes to exclude Berek HaBais. So that's your paradigmic case of Dover Shei B'Chlal, V'Yotza Min HaKlal, etc. And now we want to apply it to Eishes Ach. That Eishes Ach was included in all arayos, but yet it was taken out of the Iser Erva in the case of Yibum, and that's going to, right, lo al atzmo yotza, ela lamed al klal kula yotza, that af kol arayos nami shari. For that, of course, we're going to need the possible letter. The Gemara says, "Mi dami." How can you take that paradigmic case of Rabbi Shmuel and the Brisa and apply it to Eishes Ah? There's a fundamental difference between the two. Hasam klal be'isur, the original klal that you cannot eat kodshim, you're enjoined for eating kodshim b'tumah, would include all kodshim. The prat, meaning shlomim, be'isur, is also be'isur. So the Torah went ahead and unnecessarily repeated in that specific case of shlamim the general isur that applies to all kodshim, that you're not allowed to eat it b'tumah. Therefore, the isur mesuyam in the case of shlamim is completely redundant, and therefore we're going to say that it's coming to teach me, reveal something about the entire klal. Hacha, here on the other hand, in the case of arayos and eishes ach, klal be'isur, the Torah prohibits all arayos, and now the prat is beheaded. The Torah had to go out of its way to tell me that in the case of eishes ach for yibum, we can be matir the isur erva. So in such a case, malamed al atzmo bilvad. If you start with an isur and you have a case which is included in the klal, and then the Torah says no, there's a heter in that klal. In that case, it means that that's the exception to the rule. If you start with the klal of isur and the Torah reiterates the isur in a prat, then you can use it l'lamed al klal kuliyotza. But not when you're going in the opposite direction. You start with a klal that is what? That is isur. Now you want to tell me that in this particular case it's mutter. That's because in this particular case of eishes ach. So what the Gemara has to do now is backtrack and come up with a different paradigmic case of davar she'eh b'chlal v'yotzei meklal, such that it would now give us the specific application of eishes ach. So the Gemara actually strengthens the kasha first before it finds a different case, and it says holo dami el davar she'eh b'chlal v'yotzel lidon b'davar chadash yata yochel atzir l'klal achach zirena l'chakos b'fer. So this case of eishes ach is the exception to the rule of all arayos, and it was in the klal of all arayos, and it was coming to teach you a big chiddush, a heter yibum. In this particular case of the erev of eishes ach, you can't now put it back into the klal when the Torah took it out of the klal, unless the Torah explicitly would put it back into it. So basically, where we're holding is that now arayos, in the case of yibum, we don't know, we have no basis to assume that the Torah would allow it. Okay, so now the Gemara has to come up with a different paradigmic case of a drasha of the Yud Gimel Midos of Rabbi Shmuel. And this is going to be derived from the Parsha Mitzorah. Now, in Taras HaMitzorah, Kodshim is very complicated because the Mitzorah has to bring 3 different karbanos. He needs a keves liola, a keves liosham, and a kivso lechatos. So he needs an ola, an osham, and a chatos. And the Kohen takes the dam of the osham and he applies it to the earlobe on the right side of the mitzorah and bahonas yado v'rag. Now, in addition, the mitzorah is obligated to bring a lug shemen, and the Kohen is going to do 7 hazos lifnei Hashem with this shemen. So basically, the lug shemen, just that we have the general picture of Taras HaMitzorah B'Yom Shmini, That Lug Shevet is divided into two parts, part of which is used for Hazah, and part of which is put is what's the word I'm looking for? It's okay, I'll just say placed on the earlobe and the toes of the right toes of the Mitzorah and on his head. The Sanyo, now we have a brisa, Dover Shayu B'Chalal, V'yotza Lido B'Dover Chadash, Yetor Rashay Latzir L'Klal Ad Shiyachzera Chal Kosev B'Feirush. Ketzah, in the Asham, the Kevetz Liyochim of an Asham, of a Mitzorah, in Vayikra Yudam, V'shachat es HaKeves B'makom Asher Yishchatus HaChatos V'Esolah B'Mokom HaKodesh, Ikechatos HaSham Hu LaKohen. And the Gemara now, Rabbi Shmuel is focused on these words, Ki Kechatos HaSham Hu LaKohen, which is redundant. Umat HaMaloma Kechatos HaSham, L'fishi Yotza Sham Mitzorah Lidon B'Dover Chadash. We have something very unique about this Karban Asham. And what is that? It's the Nesinas Dam Al Boen Yad Uboen Regla Yimonis. Yachal Lo Yeton Matan Domim Ve'emurim. Once the Torah has taken Asham out of the cloud to require the Matan Domim of Boen Yoda, Boen Raglav, etc. Therefore, the Dam of this Asham Mitzvah is different than a Dam of any Karba, which is dedicated to Zrik al Gabi Mizbech. Here we need it for Nesinas Domo al Boen, etc. Is Yachal Lo Yeton Matan Domim Ve'emurim L'Gabi Mizbech. Perhaps this Asham is radically different than any other Asham, which requires Matan Domim and Haktorah Saimurim on the Mizbeach. Talmud Lomar, Ki Kechatas Asham Hu, Ma Chatas Tu'una, Matan Domim Ve'emurim L'Gabi Mizbeach, Af Asham Mitzorah, Ton Matan Domim Ve'emurim L'Gabi Mizbeach. And we see from this that he loved a Hadri Cross, not for the fact that the Torah took it back by saying Kechatas Hasham, Avamina L'mayde Nofik Nofik, L'mayde Lo Nofik Lo Nofik. So without the ribui of Kechatas Hasham, we would not be noeg in Asham Mitzorah all the other dinim of a Karban Asham, which is Matan Domim Ve'emurim Al Gabi Mizbeach. And once it's taken out of the klal, then you can't put it back into the klal. L'sochinami havamina eishes ach the ishtri shar aroyos lo. The Torah took the erev of eishes ach out of the bag of shar arayos to teach me something about eishes ach. But that's a chiddush in eishes ach that it's mutar b'makom yibum. But it did not put it back together with all the other arayas to tell me that all the other arayas are also mutar b'makom yibum. The Torah never explicitly permitted any of the arayas b'makom yibum except for eishes ach. And therefore, ilo the hadre kra is we're going to say ma'id nofik nofik, ma'id lo nofik, and we don't need a pasuk or leah to teach me that ervas achos ishto ena. Okay, so this is where we got up to here. Ella Salkut. Unbelievable how much ink has been spilled just on figuring out why we need the word alel in the case of an erva machos tishto. All right then, so everyone should have a great day.